My guest today is a historian and Bible scholar. Raised as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, he received a BS in religion from Liberty University and a Master's of Theology in Old Testament Studies from Capital Bible Seminary. He served as a chaplain in the Air Force and pastored a church for 7 years before his academic studies led him to question his faith. While receiving a Master's in Near Eastern Studies and a PhD in Assyriology as a Fulbright scholar at Johns Hopkins University, his doubts snowballed into a religious deconversion. He and his wife Megan, a fellow Assyriologist, now host a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi and a podcast called Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East, where they share their love of ancient history and Old Testament studies. As the author of 3 books, including the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, my guest has a passion for sharing the deep knowledge he's acquired while promoting objectivity, good academic rigor, and sound methodology. Today, we'll be exploring the evidence with him to uncover the true origins of the Old Testament, to see just how reliable it really is. Without any further ado, I give you Dr. Josh Bowen. Josh, I have a ton of questions to ask you about the origin of the Old Testament, but before I do, can you give us a 1 or 2 minute overview of your religious and academic background?
I was an evangelical Christian for 25, 26 years. I was raised as a fundamentalist. My grandfather was an ordained Baptist minister. So that was sword drills and Awana and the whole 9 yards, right? Church was my life. So I ended up going to Liberty University while I was on active duty in the Air Force, got commissioned as an officer and became a chaplain candidate and went to get my master's in theology, took a lot of Semitic languages and majored in Old Testament studies there. So because I did reasonably well there, I applied and got into the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in their Assyriology program. So they have an ancient Near Eastern studies department, and in it they have Egyptology, Assyriology, Hebrew Bible, and archaeology. And so I was an Assyriologist, but I took a lot of archaeology courses, a lot of Hebrew Bible courses. And I got a Fulbright scholarship while I was there, and this other German scholarship to go study in Germany for a year to do my dissertation on these Sumerian texts, which is a whole nother fun topic to talk about another time.
At what point in that process did something cause your ears to perk up and for you to kind of be like, this isn't quite what I was taught growing up? Was there a moment where things shifted for you?
Yeah, actually, when I got to Hopkins, I had a friend named Andrew Knapp, who's a brilliant Hebrew Bible scholar. He was, I think, in his 3rd year of the program. We kind of got to talking, and he said, "Oh, you're evangelical?" I said, yeah. And he goes, "Oh, this will be interesting." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, we'll just see how long it lasts." And I said, "Oh, no, you got the wrong guy, you know." The first semester, actually the first year, we had to take these history cycles, these history seminars. They were year-long seminars, and there were 3 of them. So the first was Syro-Palestine, so the history of Syro-Palestine. The next one was the history of Mesopotamia, and then the next one was the history of Egypt. I started off with Syro-Palestine in the rotation, and every week I was coming in and going, that can't be right. And Kyle McCarter was teaching the course. And every week, Andrew, it was in that class with me, and he'd say, "How you doing? How you doing?" I said, no, I'm okay. And then one week, we were talking about the late Bronze Age collapse and, all the stuff that happened around 1200 BCE with the Sea Peoples. And so the Philistines show up in Canaan. And I remember halfway through that class, I remember what desk I was sitting at in what classroom. And I just sort of snapped. And because I was like, well, if this is true, then the Old Testament is clearly wrong about this. And the way that I was raised, it's all interlocking, right? If one thing falls, so fall they all. So
if what specifically about the Philistines in the late Bronze Age collapse was true?
When they show up, like we know historically when they showed up.
And according to the Bible, it was significantly earlier?
Yeah, much earlier. And of course, as I'm sure you well know, there are apologetics that sort of try to engage with that and give explanations for it, but I don't think any of them are satisfactory.
Yeah.
But people hear me say that and they go, "Oh, well, gosh, if it was just the Philistines, man, but it wasn't that. That was sort of the thing that was the aha moment. But at the same time that I'm learning all this history of Syro-Palestine and talking about the archaeology of it, I was taking a biblical archaeology course with Barry Gitlin, and I was also taking Hebrew epigraphy. So we're reading all the old inscriptions. Of course, I was reading Sumerian and Akkadian literary texts, and all of these things together, it was just like this perfect storm.
Hmm.
And I became an atheist really overnight, it felt like. When I got that scholarship to go to Hopkins, I remember it was like the assistant dean of Capital Bible Seminary, or the dean, I can't remember, asked me, are you ready? Like, are you prepared to go into Johns Hopkins, a very liberal school? And I held up my Hebrew Bible that I was carrying and I said, well, I'm going into the lion's den, but I'm going to win souls for Christ. And about halfway through my first semester, I deconverted. I had a friend that went to seminary with me that was coming up every Thursday to take me out to get some pizza, because Hopkins is a pretty stressful place your first year. And he was, of course, a very strong evangelical Christian. And when I deconverted, he was very kind. He walked around with me, talked to me, and tried to like keep me from going too far away from the faith. But he had an uphill battle.
Both of us grew up believing that the Bible was inspired by God, was perfect, and without error, but in your book you talk about a few of the contradictory and weirdly incoherent accounts in the Bible which have led scholars to believe that it wasn't written by a single author, but was more of a mishmash of various contradicting sources. Specifically, I'm talking about the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible. Do they contain multiple contradictory accounts of the same events? Who wrote them? Was it a single author like Moses, or do we even know?
Yeah, big question, right? Well, I mean, the first one is scholars have known that one person didn't write the Pentateuch now for several centuries. This is a subdiscipline in the field of biblical studies, looking at Pentateuchal studies. And this part of the formation of the Pentateuch is even a sub part of the field. So somebody like Joel Baden is an excellent resource for anybody that really wants to do a deep dive into this. He wrote a book called On the Composition of the Pentateuch. Of course, he has lots of YouTube videos. He's done interviews. He's been on our channel. He looks in depth at the documentary hypothesis. And I guess I'll take a step back and talk about generally how this process took place, where scholars started to think, wait a minute, one guy didn't write this thing. Early on in the 12th century, I think, Ibn Ezra started to recognize things like, hey, the language here says things like on this side of the Jordan, or before there were kings in Israel.
Or to this day.
To this day, that's right. So that sort of language gave away that at least those parts are written later, because it says before there were kings in Israel. That means that the person must have been from the future when they knew there were going to be kings in Israel, or they're writing later and writing about that previous time. So then scholarship started to develop where they started noticing that there were literary inconsistencies. The story would kind of go along this way, and then all of a sudden it would shift and go a different direction, and then it would come back. There were these inconsistencies. There were contradictions. There were places where it looked like the same story was told 2 different times in almost the same way.
Can you give me some examples?
Probably the one that I use because, again, Joel Baden uses it as sort of his linchpin examples, and he does such a good job with it. So I'm greatly indebted to him for that. But in Genesis 37, you have the Joseph story. If you read it kind of quickly, like you and I both did, I'm sure, growing up, you don't really see much of a problem there, right? So if you ask somebody, hey, what's the Joseph story? Well, Joseph goes out with his brothers and he goes out to check on him, and they throw him in a pit. And then these Midianites or Ishmaelites come and get him, and they sell him to this caravan of traders, and they go to take him down to Egypt and sell him. And that's how he gets down to Egypt and Potiphar's house, and all that stuff happens. But if you actually read through Genesis 37 closely, it's a very confusing chapter. If you just ask yourself the question, how did Joseph get down to Egypt? The text starts off by saying that the brothers are sitting there and Joseph's supposed to be in a pit. And then Ishmaelite caravan comes by. And then somehow Midianites pull him out of the pit. But then the brothers are selling Joseph. But then the text says that the Midianites sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. But then later it says that the Midianites sell Joseph to Egypt. And then later in chapter 39, it says the Ishmaelites brought him down there. So for as long as, certainly back into rabbinical times, people have been wrestling with this and trying to figure out what it is. And so like one of the conclusions is that, well, maybe the brothers sold him to the Midianites, who sold him to the Ishmaelites, who took him down to Egypt, who sold him back to the Midianites, who sold him to Potiphar, right? It's like, sure, that's possible. But if you break the story apart and you keep all the Midianite stuff on this side, and it's obviously much more complex than that, but you sort of separate out the stuff that deals with the Midianites over here and the stuff that talks about the Ishmaelites over here, scholars noticed, wait, there's 2 narratives here.
That by themselves they're consistent.
That's right. And they're coherent. And of course, the big place that you see this that everybody talks about is the flood account, starting in Genesis 6, going through chapter 9, I think. So the text, if you read through it, it's weird. Are you supposed to take pairs of animals? Are you supposed to take 7 pairs? Is the flood 40 days? Is it 150 days? What day did the ark land? I mean, all kinds of things that show up in the flood story that are just inconsistent with one another. But again, if you look at, and people have been doing this for a long time now, you can very clearly break the flood story apart into 2 different stories, 2 different narratives that have been ostensibly brought together in some way. Through the Pentateuch, you could see these different narratives, these different threads that ran together, and they're all linked based on the story. And what they started to see is that, wait a minute, this particular thread talks a lot about the same types of things. Like this one is very concerned with things about priests and uses certain kind of language usually. But this one here uses a certain name for the god. This one calls him Yahweh, but this one over here calls him Elohim. And so what they started to do was notice that these different strands that were coherent formed their own narratives. And so a theory developed called the documentary hypothesis, where there were 4 separate sources, and they were called J, E, D, and P. J is for German Yahweh, because it's the name of the deity that's used there. E is for Elohim. D is for the Deuteronomist, mostly the book of Deuteronomy, and then P is for the priestly source. Again, if you want all the details on this, you can go read Joel Baden's book or any good introduction to the Hebrew Bible. And that theory holds solidly in many different parts. The consensus of scholarship is that there are different places where you have different sources that are brought together. There is a debate about whether you have major sources that were brought together, or did we have little fragments that were brought together into larger fragments, and then those fragments were edited together and then later edited together a different way? But everybody agrees that it wasn't Moses. It wasn't this one guy named Moses that wrote this thing down. And it's not based on some anti-supernatural bias or something. It's based on the literary inconsistencies themselves.
Do we know when these were written?
Most scholars, and again, this is not my area of specialization. In the book that I wrote, I have a chapter on this, and I give the reader a nice solid bibliography that they can really dive into this stuff if they want. But most scholars would agree on certain aspects of when certain books were written, as far as in what order they appear in, generally speaking. But I'm probably ill qualified compared to those that actually specialize in this to talk about when specifically these were written. Certainly, you may have some early Hebrew poetry that may go back to like the 11th century, But most of the Hebrew Bible is being composed, 8th, 7th century later. It's not back in the late Bronze Age. It's not 1406, when this is being put together by Moses.
So this isn't being written down at the time the events are allegedly taking place by eyewitnesses. It's not by one author. It's not by Moses. It's by anonymous sources, and it's, multiple sources kind of stitched together after the fact. What about the later stuff? Like once we get into the stories of Daniel talking about the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar, conquering Jerusalem, destroying the temple, taking people into Babylon, into exile. What year approximately are the events that occur in Daniel? What year is that taking place? And was Daniel written in that time? Or are those other books, are they also written later?
So Daniel's a fun one. This is supposed to be the time that Nebuchadnezzar takes over right at the end of the 7th century, so 605, 604 BCE. And it goes down through into the Persian period after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. That's when the events are supposed to have taken place. More conservative scholars, and there aren't many of them, would argue that this is like a 6th century, written in the 6th century document, right? Most evangelical scholars will say, 2nd century is when this thing's written.
If it was written in that early date, that would be incredible because there's things that Daniel prophesies that come true that happened later. So how can we tell if these are accurate prophecies that are taking place, or if it's written after the fact, acting like it was written earlier and projecting those events onto the past?
Yeah, this is why Daniel is such a hot button issue, because it's supposed to be written during this period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and predicting all the way down to Greece, which is hundreds of years later. And so if that's the case, well, this is predictive prophecy, right? Particularly when you get toward the end of the book of Daniel, where it gets a lot more detailed, it's pretty good. And so that's why this is such a big deal. They really want Daniel to be written early. So how do we know? How do we tell? There's linguistic evidence and there's historical evidence. From a linguistic side, if I were to pick up a piece of paper that said, "What ho, who art thou?" or something like that. Or
"Wherefore art thou, Romeo?"
Right, exactly. All things considered, all things being equal, we would say, okay, this is probably an early, English has developed quite a bit since then. That doesn't mean that you couldn't write something trying to mimic that earlier grammar and the speech patterns. However, if you said, "Wherefore art thou, dude?" you might say, "Oh, wait a minute." Or if in a period when the word show, SHOW, was written SHEW, if during that early period, you're spelling it with a later spelling, that's sort of another giveaway that, wait a minute, something's a little off here. The sort of thing that we see, again, very roughly showing up in the book of Daniel. So there are two languages primarily that show up in Daniel, Hebrew and Aramaic. We have some Greek, have some Persian words, whatever, but it's basically Hebrew and Aramaic on the whole. There are people that specialize in Aramaic studies, people that specialize in Hebrew, obviously, particularly with respect to dating. There's a 2-volume set out on my shelf now that essentially gets it's like a 2016 publication, and it goes through in some detail what are the 4 different stages of biblical Hebrew and what are their diagnostic features. What is it that we see? So a certain verb has a certain meaning in a particular period, and that's early. Words change their meanings over time, even though it's the same word. The same is true in other languages. So if you've got a word that's being used with a meaning that is clearly one that happens in later Hebrew text and doesn't show up in earlier text, that's an indication that it's later. Or certain letters, for example, in Aramaic, the letter Dalet and the letter Zion. Zion is used, or the Z sound is used earlier in Aramaic texts. But later Aramaic text, everywhere there was a Z, a Zion, it shifts to a D. And so if you see a document and it's using that Dalet, the D letter, where there should be a Z, it's like, oh, well, that's sort of a feature of later Aramaic, not earlier. And so there are lots of different things that scholars look at, and they're meticulous about it, and they count things, and they look at all the different Aramaic corpora that we have, and they say, okay, it's later than these, but earlier than these. So it seems to fit right in this general area here. So Aramaic is, generally speaking, it seems like scholars would say that you can't really be terribly precise with it. It's a little bit earlier than what we see at Qumran, the 2nd century, maybe BCE.
In the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, that's right, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it seems to be later than like the Elephantine papyri, later than the 5th century, but earlier than like the 2nd century. So sort of in that general area. With Hebrew, you can get a little more precise. You do it the same way. And for example, we see ani instead of the older anochi, malchut instead of mamlacha, and amad instead of kum. Again, it's very technical what they do to determine that sort of thing linguistically, but it's late. It's not what we would see back in the 6th century. So that's sort of how they do it with linguistics. But, for people that are watching, that might be a little too technical, and you don't really need it, in my opinion. There are some very clear indications that the book of Daniel is not written back in the 6th century just by the contents themselves. I give an example in my book. I have a chapter on Daniel, and I talk about if we found a book or a manuscript or something that says it was written by Thomas Jefferson, let's say, and it talks about the Revolutionary Civil War, but it talks about the Civil War coming first and then the Revolutionary War coming second, we might say, whoa, that doesn't seem to fit, right? I mean, we would expect that Thomas Jefferson would, if he's predicting the future, he would at least know that Revolutionary War comes first. But then if he said, take heart, America, and he started talking about in sort of couched or shrouded language, this man of the tower, he wouldn't have any political experience, but he's very, very wealthy, who would fight against the senator from the Northeast. And they would have a fierce battle, but take heart, America, because God will not allow the man of the tower to win the presidency. We would look at that and say, well, we probably know when this was written, particularly if they gave a lot of details about that presidential race, about the different debates and things that were said. We would say, okay, it's probably written close to the end of the presidential race between Donald Trump and Senator Hillary Clinton, but not after, because it says that Trump's not going to win. So we would know that it was close to it, where it looks like he's going to win, maybe.
But then he got it wrong.
but then he got it wrong. That's what we see in the book of Daniel. This early stuff, the stuff that the writer should know about. Sometimes he gets it right, sometimes he gets it wrong. It's very general what he says, right? There's not a lot of specifics. But then you get down to the 2nd century, late 3rd, early 2nd century, first half of the 2nd century BCE, and all of a sudden he's like Mr. Details. He's saying the king of the south will take this army and go up to the king of the north, and the woman, and they will have their gods there, and they will have this alliance, but the alliance won't last. I mean, it gets very, very detailed, and it gets it all right up to, I think, chapter 11, verse 35. I haven't looked at it in a little while, but I think it's right around 35. And then all of a sudden, it's wrong. These predictions are just wrong.
What is it specifically? Like, who is it that he's talking about with this final prophecy?
Yeah, so it really does try to couch it in vague language, like the king of the north, king of the south. Sometimes you see it like slip up and mention Egypt. So, when people want to make this, some future apocalyptic thing, it's like, they got some specifics here.
Well, they do the same thing nowadays when someone says Babylon, and they're like, oh, Babylon is clearly talking about America or something.
True. That's true. But it's talking about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And the main figure that's being talked about here is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And that's probably the most important thing to recognize if you're talking to like a Christian apologist about the dating of the book of Daniel. Ask the question, what is the 4th kingdom? Where does the book of Daniel culminate? What is the last kingdom, and who is in charge of that kingdom before God's kingdom comes? And it is absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt, clearly the kingdom of Greece. And it's Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And I talk about it in detail in the book about how to show that. But that's so important, because if it is Greece that is the final kingdom, well, then either the prophecy's wrong, just clearly it's wrong because we're still here, God's kingdom hasn't come, right? And of course, as you know, many, at least some evangelical scholars want to see Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks of Daniel, as talking about the coming of Jesus. Well, if that's the case, why is it ending with Antiochus, right? And this is why early in the first millennium CE, you had people writing and saying, you know what? Daniel did think it was Greece, but actually he didn't really understand it. It was actually Rome. Surprise, surprise that they would say that, right? Because Rome comes after them, and you can't have the kingdom of God not coming. So Daniel wasn't given the full revelation. That must be what it is. The fact that the majority of the details come from the middle of the 2nd century BCE, and then they get it wrong. I think it's in the summer of like 165 or 164. I can't remember. Scholars can like date at least that writing, the compilation of that significant portion of the book of Daniel, to like that summer or around that time, using that principle, getting early things wrong, getting late things really, really right up to a very specific point, and then getting them all wrong after that.
So with the early things that he got wrong, because he's writing after the fact, he's not necessarily very well acquainted with history.
Yeah.
What are some examples of the details that he gets wrong?
One of the things that gets mixed up a lot is Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus. And Nebuchadnezzar was the king that took over the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 605 after the Battle of Carchemish. Very powerful king, very, very popular. And of course, he features prominently in the book of Daniel. But you have this last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, whose name is Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was kind of a weird guy. He starts to worship another deity, the moon god, as opposed to Marduk, or at least primarily worship him. And he leaves his kingdom to his son, Belshazzar, goes off to this oasis of Taman, and he's there for like 10 years. It's just weird. The whole thing's weird. And then when he comes back, he really establishes the worship of the moon god, and he's not liked in later accounts of the history of the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so crazy stories that surround Nabonidus get picked up on in later history. So if you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a story, I think it's called the Prayer of Nabonidus. And lo and behold, it sounds remarkably similar to a section of Daniel, but it's a story about Nebuchadnezzar going crazy because he boasts that he's the greatest, he's the man, the myth, the legend. He doesn't walk on water, but nothing above the ankles gets wet. And God's like, nah, striking you down. And he has to go off and eat grass, and his nails grow real long. He goes crazy for 7 years. Well, you have a very similar story there, Qumran, but it's about Nabonidus. It's not about Nebuchadnezzar. And there are a couple different places in Daniel where the stories kind of get mixed up, and things that are normally attributed to Nabonidus get attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. For example, Nebuchadnezzar is called the father of Belshazzar, but he's not. We know he's not. Nabonidus was. And so there's this whole Christian apologetic that goes to great lengths to say, oh, in Hebrew and Semitic, father doesn't have to necessarily just mean father. It can mean grandfather. And then you say, yeah, but he wasn't his grandfather. They say, yeah, but Nebuchadnezzar had a daughter that married another Neo-Babylonian king. And so maybe it's possible he had another daughter that married Nabonidus. You're like, yeah, I mean, is that possible? Sure. But if he's mixing up Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar in another place in the book, pretty clearly, he's probably mixing it up here too. And it just seems like there are different traditions that came down into the 2nd century where Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar sort of got mixed up, which is just not unheard of. Those are the sorts of things that you would expect. There's the whole problem of Darius the Mede, who's supposed to be the one that takes over Babylon following the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And of course, even that fall, it's said to have happened under Belshazzar, but Belshazzar was not king. He was never king, and he certainly wasn't on the throne at the time. Nabonidus had come back. So the idea that it falls to Belshazzar is just flatly wrong. There is no Darius the Mede. And believe me when I tell you, conservative scholars, evangelical scholars have gone to very great lengths to try to identify a possible Darius the Mede. In fact, a good friend of mine who I went to seminary with went down and did his PhD at Dallas Theological Seminary. And he wrote a book, published it, I think, in 2014. And it's trying to say that Cyaxares II is Darius the Mede. And there are all kinds of problems with that. But at any rate, it's a problem. It's a problem that they continue to wrestle with. And the reason it's a problem is because we know who was reigning in the Achaemenid Empire. Like, we know it was Cyrus, who's Darius the Mede. So yeah, it's very problematic.
Cyrus wasn't a Mede, though. He was a Persian, correct?
Yeah, and this is why. So when you see things like the Medo-Persian Empire and you see the 2 horns and they're like, oh, well, that's supposed to be one that allows for the 4th kingdom to be Roman. It's like, yeah. Like, you get it. You get that there's this 4-kingdom schema. It's like a trope that shows up in the latter half of the 1st millennium. So it's not surprising that you have this like Babylon, Mede, Persian, Greece layout. It's not surprising. You see it other places. What's surprising, or what's important, again, is that it all ends with Greece. That's the key, I think, to all of this. So yes, Cyrus he's not a Mede, but of course, people try to make Cyrus Darius, and they try to make a guy named Ugbaru or Gubaru Darius the Mede. Actually, Whitcomb, I think, was the one that wrote an article and like mixed up the two. There are 2 Ugbarus, Gubarus, right? He mixes them up. I think I'm remembering that correctly. There are lots of different ways that apologists and evangelical scholars try to come at this, but the reason that they're trying to come at it is because it's a problem.
Because they've already concluded that the Bible can't be mistaken.
Yeah. In fact, in that book I was just mentioning about my friend, his name's Stephen Anderson, not that Stephen Anderson. Different Stephen Anderson, a less crazy Stephen Anderson. He has a footnote, I think it's in chapter 2, where he says, essentially, I'll paraphrase it, but the book of Daniel is not just another historical source that we can critique based on other historical sources, but it is the inspired, infallible, inerrant Word of God, and therefore is the standard by which we must judge other historical sources. I mean, when you start there, you have to do this stuff. You have to jump through the hoops because you're working backwards from your conclusion.
What about later prophecies? What about the prophecy of Tyre that Ezekiel made about the fall of Tyre? We're looking now significantly later. Well, I guess Tyre fell later, but the prophecy would have still been about Babylon. What's the deal with the prophecy of Tyre made by Ezekiel? Is this another example of a failed prophecy?
Yeah, this is another one that I'm actually sort of surprised to see it debated on social media, because in academic circles, evangelical or not, like, everybody agrees that it didn't come to pass the way Ezekiel said it was going to. It's just like there's no way around it. In Ezekiel chapter 26 to 28, Jerusalem has just fallen in 586 to Nebuchadnezzar. Ezekiel sees this and gives this prophecy against the island city of Tyre. And it's not surprising that he gives that prophecy. as far as like it's part of a genre, something called the oracles against the nations. You see this sort of thing in many different prophets. But what he does is he prophesies in chapter 26 the complete destruction of the island city of Tyre. I mean, to the point that the word Tyre is tsor, and it means like rock. It was built on a rock. So the idea here is in the text, it says he will be scraped clean down to a bare rock. In other words, it's going to be completely destroyed and thrown into the sea. So the problem with the prophecy, of course, is that it doesn't happen. We have Ezekiel as a source and we have Josephus as a source. Nebuchadnezzar marches up, lays siege. It looks like the siege lasts 13 years. Nebuchadnezzar never gets in. It looks like the king of Tyre eventually capitulates. It pays tribute to get the siege lifted. But Nebuchadnezzar goes back home with his army and Tyre doesn't fall.
And even Ezekiel admits to this failure of a prophecy.
That's right. So if you go to chapter 29 of Ezekiel, starting around verse 17, it's dated to 15 years after his initial prophecy against Tyre. So if you think about it, like theoretically 13 years have gone by. Siege has lasted that long. They didn't get in. Nebuchadnezzar goes home. People are looking at it. It's like he's not coming back. Tyre's good. Ezekiel, what's a dizzle? And so, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar worked so hard against Tyre. It says every head was made bald and every shoulder was rubbed bare, ostensibly carrying siege baskets, But he didn't get any pay for all his efforts. And so I'm going to give him Egypt as his pay, as his wages. He's going to plunder it. He's going to despoil it. So two things are noteworthy there. First of all, the fact that he says it didn't happen. Sorry, guys. Is this thing on? Didn't happen. And then secondly, he's going to get Egypt, which also didn't happen.
Did Nebuchadnezzar ever invade Egypt at all?
We have a very fragmentary cuneiform tablet that talks about some sort of military effort against Egypt. But I mean, certainly not what's described in the text.
But he never conquered it.
Yeah, I mean, he never takes it, right? That's ridiculous. So no, I mean, he never takes it as plunder. And again, the reason that this is funny to me is that you'll have Christian apologists that say things like, well, in Ezekiel 26, it says, God is going to send many nations against Tyre, like the waves of the sea. So Babylon was just the first. Nebuchadnezzar was just the first, right? The problem is several-fold. First of all, I give examples of this in the book. I won't bore the listener with it here, but that language is not unique, even in Ezekiel. The Neo-Babylonian army was made up of many nations itself, right? So you had Assyrians that were under it, amongst others. And even Babylonia itself was made up of the Chaldeans. And anyway, it's a no-go. It's a non-starter. Even though it sounds really nice in the English, it just doesn't play. But the bigger issue here is that evangelical scholars recognize this. There's a guy named Chris Udd who wrote a brilliant article on this, laying out basically all the bad apologetics. And of course, he's an evangelical and he still takes an inspired approach to this. Robert Chisholm is another that wrote an article on this. And one of the popular arguments now is that it's not that Ezekiel's prophecy was wrong. It's that prophecy is inherently contingent. So the example that is always given is Jonah going to preach against the city of Nineveh. And the message is 40 days, you're going to be destroyed. So what do? They repent. God doesn't destroy it. So it's like the prophecy is intended to get a result. Well, that's true. There's no question that that's true. Not always, but very often prophets are there to get people to do things differently, right? That's the point. But what he has to argue here is that even though we don't know how, the king of Tyre must have repented. Then he goes so far as to say, and I guess that's true of the Egyptians as well. That's why they didn't get plundered and destroyed. It's yeah, okay. That's one possibility. But certainly that's a better argument, in my opinion. The theological argument is certainly a better one than trying to just argue that it's supposed to be about Alexander the Great or something, or that Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city of Ushu, which is one of the mainland cities, and that took him 13 years to take. It's nonsense.
Even in the case of Alexander the Great, though, Tyre wasn't wiped clean. The city still continued on.
That's right. And they like to sort of tout out, well, look, it says here in the text that the stones and the timbers will be thrown into the sea. Well, that's what Alexander the Great did. He destroyed the mainland cities and took them apart and used them to build that causeway. But see, that's not what the text says. The text says that the timbers and the stones from the island, from the destruction of the island, will be thrown into the sea. So you can't just go, saying whatever you want about the text and move shit around. Like, it doesn't work that way. And yeah, you're exactly right. Like, Alexander, when he got in, it's not that he did what Ezekiel said he was going to do. In fact, I think there was like a regime change. I don't even know that there was a regime change, actually. It's later than what I usually study. But I mean, certainly some people were killed. But I mean, it wasn't like what Ezekiel says, like wiping it to a bare rock where fish nets are going to be dried. That's not what happened.
The entire city itself wasn't sacked.
That's right.
But isn't there a verse earlier in the Pentateuch that specifically outlines how you can spot a false prophet? That has to do with if they say something and it doesn't come to pass, then that's a false prophet.
Yeah, I looked this up recently. It's in Deuteronomy 18. And it's the idea that a false prophet is one that says X is going to happen. And if it doesn't, then he's not the real thing. He's not the real deal. And you shouldn't fear him.
But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. How shall we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken.
So yeah, that's why pick up a good commentary on the book of Ezekiel, and you'll see that there are different places, like I think in chapter 13 of Ezekiel, and of course here in 26 and in 29, like Ezekiel struggles with people trusting his prophecies. There are problems in his time, right? In his time. So the fascinating thing, maybe just as a brief aside, is that they're left in there. These prophetic texts underwent editing as time went by. So the fact that later editors and later prophetic schools left that in there, knowing that it was something that he said, but that didn't actually happen, is interesting in and of itself.
Josh, I thoroughly enjoyed the first volume of your book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, so I'm delighted that I get to announce to our viewers that not only is Volume 2 about to be released, but it just became available for pre-order, and I've got a special link to that, which I'm going to put in the description of this video. And guys, the more people who go out and pre-order it, the higher it's going to rank in Amazon on launch day, and the more people this stuff will reach. And boy, do we need people to read this stuff. So let's make it a bestseller. But as a special teaser, Josh, what exactly is going to be contained in Volume 2? Can you give us kind of a sneak peek?
Each volume of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament is structured where you have the first 3 chapters are designed to give general background information to the ancient Near East, the Old Testament, the world of the Bible, things like archaeology, history, and what the story of the Old Testament actually is. And then chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 are each their own sort of hot button issue, things that Christian apologists will talk about, that if you're an atheist and you're looking to have discussions about these things, these are things that you're going to see. These topics that we talked about tonight show up in Volume 1. In Volume 2, we talk about things like the historicity of the Exodus. Is it history? Is it myth? Somewhere in between. What is it that scholars say about that? If you've ever heard people talking about the city of Jericho or the city of Ai, the conquest narrative, does it hold up, historically speaking, under the archaeological record? Did the Old Testament plagiarize earlier myths in writing its own myths? I have a chapter on sex crimes, adultery, and rape in the Hebrew Bible. And what did they consider adultery? What do they consider rape? What are its punishments? And how does it compare to the wider ancient Near East? And the last one is divine violence and genocide. It's a rough chapter in that the topic itself is difficult, particularly if you're a Christian and you're holding to this sort of inerrantist view. There are a lot of things in the Hebrew Bible, divine commands of violence, that people like Paul Copan, as much as I like Paul and I have talked before, the way that he handles divine violence is just, it's very apologetic, and it just doesn't hold up. So things like, if you've ever heard people say, oh, well, it's just hyperbole, where it says, you're supposed to slaughter the Canaanites. Well, it's just like when you're saying like the Steelers slaughtered the Ravens, in the football game. It's just, no. Things like, well, the Canaanites, the Amalekites deserved it. We go into that, both from a historical standpoint and a literary standpoint. So I think it gets to the heart of the very difficult issue. I think it gives a good framework to think about it. But
I'm diving into that topic myself right now because I'm working on the next few episodes of Nothing Fails Like Bible History. And one of the apologetic arguments for the conquest of Canaan that I hear is this notion that they weren't actually killing them because the word harem doesn't mean to wipe them out. It means, John Walton talks about this at length and how it's more of a banishment and just pushing them out of the land, saying they're off limits to you Israelites so that you don't interbreed with them and take up their gods. And yet the more that I dive into the context of this, it becomes abundantly clear that that's not what they're saying.
I don't want to spoil your video or anything, but yes, it certainly does mean ban. But ban and banishment are different things. So, without giving any spoilers or anything, what does it mean for something to be banned? And what does it mean for it to be off limits? Does it mean that you can just sort of let it be? What happens to things that are under the ban, under cherem? That's the key to it.
Or that are dedicated to God.
That's right. They're dedicated to God. That's what the word talks about. It's dedication.
Yeah. And it's like, dedicated how? Like a sacrifice? Like
you got to tune in to find out, right?
As a quick summary, we've talked about the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, and why scholars think that it wasn't written by Moses, or even a single author at all, but was a compilation from multiple authors written down centuries after the events which allegedly took place. We discussed the problems with Daniel's prophecies, and we showed why it was most likely written after the events that it was claiming to prophesy. And finally, we covered the failed prophecies of Ezekiel. All of this just goes to demonstrate that while the Bible is full of fascinating stories and sometimes kernels of history, the claims of divine inspiration and literal inerrancy are problematic, to say the least. This has been an absolute thrill to have this conversation with you, Dr. Bowen. Where can people go if they want to find your work?
Yeah, so we're over on Digital Hammurabi, Hammurabi, just like the old Babylonian king that I'm sure everyone is familiar with. That's our YouTube channel. My wife does a lot of great work over there. She's also an Assyriologist. Of course, I've got the volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook coming out later on this year. I've got an article that's going to be published in an edited volume about evangelical misuse of the Old Testament. That should be coming out, I think, early next year. It's a Routledge publication.
Dr. Bowen and I will also be speaking at a conference called Better in Fort Wayne, Indiana this coming weekend, June 25th to 26th, which will focus on how to have better conversations as atheists and skeptics with religious people to build bridges and improve dialogue, as well as how to build healthier communities in our own non-religious circles. There will be a host of phenomenal speakers and special guests, including Seth Andrews, Shannon Q, Paula Gia, Biddy Buddha, Genetically Modified Skeptic, and a ton more. Tickets are still available, but it is fast approaching, so snag them quick. I'll link to that below as well, and I look forward to seeing all of you guys there. Josh, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to engaging with you in the future on these topics. Once you write your next book, we're going to have you come back on and talk about it.
Awesome. Well, it was an absolute pleasure. I appreciate you having me.